last week and where we are today. We've been talking about fear and things that hold us captive in fear. And as the cute little skit showed, there's probably all kinds of fears that people have. I mean, I'm sure some of you out there today have this fear of going bald. I see some fingers pointing over here. And I wonder, maybe one or two of you have that fear of garden gnomes. Evil garden gnomes that are coming to get you in the middle of the night. Fear. We all have them. This past week I decided to raise the website that listed all the known fears and phobias that people struggle with. And as you probably suspect, there are literally hundreds of things that people fear. For fun, let me just read a few of these things that people are afraid of. Now these are all big words, so I'm going to try and do my best to pronounce them. Androphobia. Anyone know what androphobia is? Oh.
Fear of men.
Fear of what?
Men.
That is correct. Very good. Fear of men. Yes. Agoraphobia. That's the fear of being in a crowd. Agoraphobia. Bathmophobia. Anyone wonder? What do you think, Grady? Oh, that's what I would have guessed. Afraid of being in a bathtub or afraid of baths. No. Bathmophobia? Fear of stairs. Fear of stairs. I don't get that one. Belanomophobia. I tried my best on that one. The fear of needles and pins for those in nursing professions. Chirophobia. That's the fear of hands. Some people are definitely afraid of hands. Coulrophobia. Coulrophobia. The fear of clowns. Clowns. Ecclesiophobia. Someone might be able to get to this one. Ecclesiophobia. Linda?
Fear of church.
Fear of the church. You've got two. Very good. Fear of the church. Some people are afraid of the church. Ichthyophobia. Fear of fish. Fear of fish. Gymnophobia. Now again, your mind says, afraid of gym? Something like that. Afraid of nudity. Nudity. Philemophobia. Fear of kissing. Omphalophobia. I hope none of you have this one. Omphalophobia. Fear of belly buttons. Lollipop gildophobia. I kid you not. Lollipop gildophobia. The fear of little people. Midgets. Fears. You name it, then probably someone is going to be afraid of it. But as we talked about last week, some fear isn't all that bad. But when fear grows to the point of being restricting, enslaving, to use Paul's words, then that is something we have to deal with. Because as we said last Sunday, God's will for us is to live with minimal fear. Remember that? We talked about that in Romans. God's will for us is to live with minimal fear. So if it's God's will for you and I to live with minimal fear, how do we go about getting a handle on some of those things that constantly hold us back, hold us down? Well, the video clip that you saw with the skit guys gave a suggestion that I think has merit. If you're trying to minimize a certain fear in your life, do the thing that you're afraid of. For example, if you're afraid of stairs, the more you walk on stairs without incident, the less likely fear will control your life. Fear will begin to diminish every time you walk on stairs without any incident. If you're afraid of fish or of dogs, expose yourself to fish and dogs, and if you do that time and time again without incident, then chances are good your fear of fish or dogs will lessen. Last week I shared during the children's message that I've always had this little fear of heights. But I go up on ladders and I go on roofs and shingle and I fly and I do those things because I know that every time I do them without incident, then that fear that I have will lessen just a little bit. In a former congregation where I was serving as pastor, I had a rock climber in that congregation. And one day he invited me to go rock climbing. Baraboo Bluffs State Park, Baraboo State Park. And I wasn't too keen about the idea of doing a little rock climbing with him, but I went. As I was hanging on the side of that cliff, I have to admit there was a little part of me that kind of enjoyed that experience. Do the thing you fear. And chances are good that fear will lessen. But there are some things that you and I are afraid of that we can't try. There are some things that we're afraid of that we can't sample. Like death. I mean, you can't sample death, can you? No. I mean, death is final. Once it comes. Game, set, match. It's over. So there's no trying death. So what do you do if you're stuck in that situation when you have this little bit of fear of death? First, recognize that that fear is common. You're not alone. As we talked about last week, some great saints of the church struggled with a real fear of death. Martin Luther, founder of the Lutheran church movement, really wrestled with death and his fear of it in his final days of his life. It is common to have a fear of death. Now, when you're a young buck or a young doe, you usually don't even think about death, let alone develop a fear towards it. But as we age, as we all move closer to that point where we know our time is short, then that fear starts to grow just a little bit. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when the telephone rang. It was the hospital. There was a man there who was dying. He didn't have a church. He didn't have a pastor. He requested to see the hospital chaplain. Well, I was a volunteer chaplain on call that night, and so, of course, I responded. When I got to the hospital, got up to the floor, the nurse who was tending him met me so that I could visit with her before I walked into his room. She said the man was indeed dying, but death was not imminent that night. She said, he's not going to die tonight, but he thinks he's going to die tonight, and so he's extremely agitated. I've loaded him up with all kinds of drugs and medications. He's got enough medication in him to knock out an elephant, but he is so afraid tonight that medication is not effective. She says, I don't know what you do, but you got to get him to calm down so that medication can take hold. Well, I walked into his room, introduced myself, pulled up a chair right next to the bed, asked him a couple of key questions, and all of a sudden he just opened right up. He said he was not a godly man. had no time for God, church, and faith. He said he didn't think there was a life after death, but he said if there was, he was positive he was going to that place of fire. And that terrorized him. So we started to talk. 2 hours went by, and then we were praying as I held his hand. When I left the room, he was starting to fall asleep. That's how it is for some people. Their fear is so strong. 2 days later, the thing that he feared came calm. So how do you deal with that kind of fear? You begin by building a relationship with God. Amen? Amen. And that's what we did that night in his room. We started to build for him that relationship with God. When you have a relationship with God, as I told the children, God becomes your friend. And when God is your friend, God promises to walk with you through all the events of life. Amen? And one of those events of life is death. And that's exactly what Becca read for us earlier from the 23rd Psalm. Powerful psalm. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Because you, God, are with me. The psalmist says that when God is your friend, you meet death not alone, but with God holding your hand. God promises to be with you. God promises that when the fear starts to well up and you become anxious and uptight and you become afraid, that God will fill your cup till it overflows with mercy and goodness and peace. God will walk with you through the experience of death and lead you to that home above, where we dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Building a relationship with God is the best way to begin to minimize fear in your life. She was a dear saint in the church that I was serving. The very first congregation I served in Bloomer, Wisconsin. Dear, dear saint. And she was dying. She had lived a good, full life. Hazel was about 83, 84. I visited her, talked with her, shared prayer with her, basically said my goodbyes because she was going to die later that day. And then I left, but her husband was right by her side, holding her hand. And Lloyd said that about 2 hours after I left, she had slipped into a coma. And all of a sudden, he said, she raised her arm and she pointed. And he said, as she was raising her arm and pointing, this wonderful smile came across her face. And he said she opened her mouth and she whispered, "He's here. He's here." And her arm came down and she took one